of area are going to be much different than something that's going to work in this type area where basically you don't have any space that's not covered with some sort of non-target species, an ornamental species. And then there also might be some more naturalistic type landscapes that people have. These areas might be, low percentage of turf. It might be something where there's a lot of shade, a lot of tree cover, especially in some of these older neighborhoods that you see. People often have, these large, beautiful oak trees and stuff like that. And people, in those type of situations, turf is probably not going to be, a large percentage of that landscape just because turf isn't going to typically grow well in that shade. So that might be a case where somebody might want to use some ground covers and things like that, a lot of mulch beds, shade-loving plants, etc. And then also there's, the opposite end of that is an area with a lot of direct sunlight. And then people might want, they value the turf grass. They want space for kids to play or whatever. So the space is mostly turf grass. But this is what, no matter what it starts out looking like, if we don't control the weeds and we don't take care of the turf and we don't take care of the landscape, this is what can happen. I've seen it many, many times where people will spend a lot of time and energy getting a landscape installed, and a lot of times that's what people really focus a lot of their efforts, time, and money on is that installation part, especially in these new builds and things like that. They put effort into the install part without much thought going behind the maintenance and how much maintenance is this going to really require, because no matter how good of a landscape you start off with, if you don't control those pests, if you don't take care of those plants, the pests are going to take over, and weeds are going to be typically the most visible thing. And I always say, with these different landscape plants, turf grass, etc., we can pick stuff that is fairly insect resistant or doesn't get a lot of insect issues. We can pick plants that will thrive in a bunch of different conditions and not get or be prone to getting a lot of diseases. But weeds are unbiased. Weeds are going to come into whatever kind of environment that we create, and there's no such thing as a weed-resistant lawn or landscape. So the primary landscape area. So no matter how the landscape is designed, what different sections are in there. We looked through a couple of different types of examples there, but they're typically going to be comprised of about 5 major classifications of areas. So turf, that's usually the largest area. That's typically what comprises most of the space, and that's just because people often think of turf as being rather low maintenance, especially if people don't really care in terms of having weeds and stuff in their turf grass. They just want something that's green and low growing. Turf can be low maintenance and just require mowing in a lot of cases. And then you have the mulch beds, so shrubs, trees surrounded by the mulch, those planting bed type things. And then kind of, I guess it could be classified as a mulch bed or a landscape bed, but I kind of classify it as a different bed, and that would be flower or color bed. So that might be something where someone has a smaller area where it's more intensively managed, and that might be something where they're putting annual color in maybe every year or every season. When I worked for landscape companies in Atlanta, we would go to a lot of these neighborhoods, and part of the maintenance contract was basically their color or their color contracts, basically is kind of what they were termed for short. But basically going in, planting stuff in the spring or summer annuals, and then coming back in the fall and spring, planting those cool season annuals. So it would be something that's changed out with these annual plants fairly regularly. And then you have hardscapes. So that could be driveways, it could be patio pavers, anything like that. So hardscapes would be another area, and weeds can definitely come in those, especially with the pavers and things like that. And so that will be another area of weed control or other place where weed control will be needed. And then 5 is gardens. So if you paid attention, a lot of attention to the news recently, there's a lot of interest in people gardening and growing their own food. That was kind of increasing before the pandemic stuff hit, but even more so now, where People are more interested in growing their own food, and there's a lot more interest in people having vegetable gardens or fruit gardens and things like that. And so those areas might comprise a pretty large portion of some landscapes as well. And that space is probably increasing too. So knowing how to control weeds in those areas is going to be important, because we can't use the same methods around food as we can just our regular run-of-the-mill landscape plants. So we'll go through each of these different areas and talk about some of the options that are there. And I'll go through these rather briefly because I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on either one of these areas, but I do have a lot of options there. And then I want to leave enough time for questions at the end of this also. So weed control and turf. So what are the basic strategies that you have? Herbicides are going to be the first thing that people typically turn to, because we do have a lot of herbicides that can be used in turf grass. Broadleaf herbicides, sedge herbicides, things to control broadleafs and sedges, even for grasses that people have a hard time controlling. A lot of these grasses, a lot of the pre-emergence herbicides will control those grasses pretty well. So herbicides will probably be the most common way that people are controlling weeds in turf grass. It's always going to be easier to control weeds in a monoculture type system as opposed to a mixed planting. So in the turf grass, we typically have one species. Easy to find a herbicide that's going to be safe on that that large area, as opposed to in a landscape planting bed where we might have 10 or 15 species. It's going to be much more difficult to find a herbicide that's going to be safe for all those plants. So herbicides used a lot in turf grass. Also hand weeding. So especially in smaller turf areas, hand weeding can be effective, and sometimes it's the most effective thing that we have for some options, like say crabgrass and St. Augustine grass. So sometimes that crabgrass can be pulled out pretty easily, whereas if we were to try to use some sort of herbicide, we would cause a lot of injury to the turf. But the number one way to control weeds in turf grass is just proper cultural practices. If we take care of that turf, it's going to take care of us in terms of weeds. So keeping that turf healthy as possible is really the best thing. So proper mowing, irrigation, fertilization. There's a lot of articles out there on our University of Florida's EDIS website that give guides in terms of how to manage each of those different grasses. And I like to give the example, somebody that I work with, that I do a lot of extension courses with. He's a consultant and used to work for a pest control company, but he moved down to down South Florida, I believe it was West Palm. But basically, the homeowner that had the home before him, spent a lot of time and effort on their lawn, was using herbicides 4 or 5 times a year to keep the weeds down, doing a lot of fertilization and things like that, mowing, all the time, doing everything, but spending a lot of time and money taking care of that turf grass. So my friend that knows, a lot about pest management, he did this for a living. He went, did an inspection. All he did was added basically double the amount of irrigation heads in that turf grass. And then in 4 years, he said, 1 herbicide application, because that turf is so much healthier than it was in the past. So really reduce those costs just by making one simple fix, making sure that turf is watered properly. So looking at those simple things, weeds are kind of a cause of they're a symptom of a problem. They're not usually, some weeds can come in regardless of how well of a job we do, but oftentimes they're a symptom and they're a secondary invader. So we've got to figure out what is the cause, what is causing that turf to struggle and let those weeds come in and grow. So if you're going to use pesticides or herbicides, I say know your active ingredients. So people need to know what herbicides it is that they're using, and then it can just be reading the label. I'd say probably of all the herbicide questions that I answer, 75% of those could have been answered if someone had read the pesticide label. And I say know the active ingredients. Weed Be Gone is not a herbicide. That's not really a herbicide. That's just the name or the trade name of something. So that doesn't really tell you much about it. So you need to read that label, and all these names are interchangeable, and they can be very confusing going to a big box retailer and looking at those herbicides, because they're all called the same thing, and those active ingredients and the uses of those herbicides can be completely different. So know what those active ingredients do. And then know the turf grass, especially if it's St. Augustine grass. So oftentimes, herbicide might be safer or not safe for floor tamler, etc. Those St. Augustine grass varieties, it can be very difficult to tell those apart. So making sure that you know the exact kind of St. Augustine grass that you have is important. And if you don't, just steer away from those herbicides that can't be used on certain varieties of St. Augustine. So knowing the brand name or trade name doesn't really cut it. Know what active ingredients you're using, because the trade names change, the active ingredients can change, formulations and mixtures can change. Read the label even if you're familiar with the product. And here, these are 3 examples of Roundup products. All have different active ingredients in there, but they're all called basically Roundup. So if someone called and said, I injured a plant with Roundup, and they used one of these, I would have no idea what the active ingredient was that they were using. Roundup for lawns doesn't even have glyphosate in it as an active ingredient. There's Roundup crabgrass preventer, which is just pendimethalin, doesn't have any post-emergence activity. So, and then also you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and you see all these products that are called Image. Image used to refer to imazaquin, which is a sedge herbicide, but now Image, they have Image for crabgrass, Image for lawns, which is atrazine, all these different things. So knowing those active ingredients and reading those labels is very important. I saw that this was a big issue. So recently I came out with this EDIS publication. So this is the Florida Homeowner Herbicide Guide. And I don't talk about specific products. I talk about active ingredients, because you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and you look, they might have 40 different herbicides there. There's going to be 3 or 4 active ingredients that are the same in all of those different herbicides. If you know what those active ingredients do, you're going to be able to choose the best product based upon the cost and the use and what you need to use it for. Knowing those active ingredients is very important, because they can put a lot of different stuff, in terms of marketing and things like that. But really, it comes down to the herbicide's active ingredient in terms of how it's going to perform and where it should be. What are your options with it? That and then the information that's on the label. If you're considering pre-emergence herbicides to control a particular weed, knowing if pre-emergence herbicides are even going to work, different weeds are going to spread from seeds, which is where, the pre-emergence herbicides would have some benefit. But then you also have some things like, for example, dollarweed. Yes, it spreads from seed, but it's primarily spreading through rhizomes. And then you go up to Florida betony. Same thing there. It's primarily spreading through rhizomes. Pre-emergence herbicides, they might slow it down a little bit, but they're not going to be, the most effective option. Then there's also a lot of other things like crabgrass, doveweed, spurges, goosegrass, wood sorrel or oxalis, artillery weed. All those are spreading almost exclusively through seeds. So pre-emergence herbicides will be very effective on those. So knowing a little bit about how those weeds spread can really help you in terms of choosing the right kinds of herbicides for those different types of weeds. And then calibration is key. It doesn't matter what herbicide you use. If it's not put at the right rate, it's not going to be effective. So this is a simple way that people can, if someone doesn't have much experience, this is a simple way that people can get the right rate down. So calculate the square footage of the area that someone needs to treat. Say it's a turf area. They calculate the entire square footage, figure out how much product is needed for that entire area, and then apply it evenly to the area. So for an example, say that a lawn is 3,600 square feet, and you want to apply a product 2 pounds per 1,000 square feet. So you need 7.2 pounds to treat that entire area. So you could put that into the spreader, put it on a very low setting, and then make as many passes as possible. And then you make sure that you're spraying that product evenly over that area. A lot of people will look at labels and things like that and look at the settings, and labels might say something about the settings that are used. I haven't found any of those to be accurate. Some of them might be, but when I've tested those, they can be wildly off, and that's because oftentimes it doesn't account for the fact that people are going to be walking at different speeds and things like that. So, and then also applying at different elevations and stuff. So this is just a simple way that someone could do, a homeowner could do, to treat very small areas. So using herbicides is a choice. Decide if it's even worth treating. You might have some of these annual weeds at certain times of the year, and that might not even be worth treating. For example, doveweed. If you have it really bad in September, October, that doveweed's about to die. That doveweed's not going to live much longer than that. So why go out and potentially harm the turf to control that doveweed that's going to be dead, in a couple of weeks? Or do effective treatments even exist? Bermuda grass and St. Augustine, that's one where we can't control that selectively. So it might not even be worth, trying to control that with herbicides, or it might be a issue where you want to start all over, or just do maintenance practices to try to help the St. Augustine and crowd out the Bermuda grass. So what's the best options? Pre-emergence, post-emergence, which active ingredient? Those things can be found in those guides that I talked about, and then also on the herbicide labels, and then a lot of the other informational resources that are out there. And then sometimes non-chemical options are going to be the most effective. Herbicides are definitely not cure-alls. They can't control all the weeds in every situation. And so sometimes it's easier to start with some of these non-chemical options as opposed to even trying a herbicide. So the keys to good turf weed control, picking the right turf for the right area, that's going to be the number one, and that kind of ties in with having the proper cultural practices in place. Basically, keeping that turf healthy. That's going to be a lot more effective than number three, which is using those control measures, non-chemical methods, and then herbicides. But if that turf is never healthy, it's always going to be prone to getting weeds, no matter how many herbicides or how many control measures you use. If someone's trying to plant Bermuda grass in a very shaded lawn, that lawn's always going to get weeds. That turf is never going to look healthy. No matter what we put down on that turf, it's always going to struggle. And so picking the right turf for the right place and then maintaining it properly is going to be the best defense against weeds. So mulched areas. So mulch, I said, that's the cornerstone of a good weed control program in the landscape. We want to pick coarse texture mulches and at least about 2 inches thick. They're going to control annual weeds better than perennials, but they will control some perennial weeds also. And then we want, I said, the coarse textured stuff, so stuff like pine bark, pine straw, some of the larger wood chips, some of the finer shredded wood chips, and then some of the I've even seen people go out with compost and things like that and use that as mulch. That might be healthy for the plants or for vegetables and things like that, but that's not going to help you with weed control. In a lot of cases, that can even promote weed growth because those finer shredded materials can hold a lot more water inside the mulch layer. We want that mulch layer to dry out quickly and just for the soil beneath it to hold the moisture. So primary organic landscape mulch types. So we've got the different bark, shredded wood materials, and then pine straw. So there's a lot of different things that are out there. So how are these really different? And which one is going to be the most effective in terms of weed control? So the way that mulches are going to actually control weeds is about 4 different methods, really 3 different methods. One is creating a physical barrier. So basically just blocking those weeds from coming up. Those weeds are going to have some resources to be able to push up through that mulch. And then the mulches that create a good physical barrier, those are going to be most effective on the seeds that are below the mulch or already there. And then reducing light. A lot of seeds require sunlight in order to germinate. So that's another way that weeds will, or that mulch will control weeds. And then reducing available water inside the mulch layer. We're not reducing water to the soil, and in fact, we're keeping moisture levels more constant and better in the soil. It actually will promote the growth of the plant. But we want that mulch layer to dry out very quickly so that when weed seeds land in that mulch layer, they don't have any moisture there. So we want mulches that are going to create a physical barrier, reduce light, and dry out quickly. So that's why those coarse textured materials are typically the best. Mulches can also control weeds through what's called allelopathy. They're basically exuding chemicals as they break down. But with most of the commercially available mulch materials, that's not going to be a very effective method. and we haven't really seen many allelopathic effects of the commercially available mulches that are out there. So this is particle size analysis of 3 different types of mulch. So hardwood, like a shredded wood material, and as these particle sizes go down, so this is in inches, 2 inches, 1 inch, all the way down to fractions of an inch. As this particle size goes down, the percentages here are the percent of whatever is in that bag that falls within that particle range. So we want most of our materials to be at these larger particle sizes, kind of like pine bark. That means that those materials are going to be larger, and they're not going to hold much water inside that mulch layer. That water is going to go straight through, and it's not going to hold much moisture. Some of these very finely shredded wood materials, like this eucalyptus here, you have basically a bunch of a large concentration, 40% or more in this particular sample, was 1/4 inch or smaller. And so those little fine materials are going to stick tighter together, and they're going to hold more moisture, and it's going to take longer for it to dry out. So why is that bad? Well, if a weed seed lands on top of that mulch layer and it's holding all that moisture, the weeds are going to be able to germinate and grow. Pine straw really dries out very quickly. Most of it is above 2 inches. You have those long needles, and they're going to dry out very quickly after the rainfall or irrigation is applied. They just tend to break down a little bit faster than some of the other materials. So this is the water holding capacity over 24 hours of these different mulch types. Here's pine bark with this red bar. The green bar right here is pine straw. So basically, we're only holding about 15% of the applied moisture after 24 hours, or really less than 15%. And then here's hardwood. So after 24 hours, we're holding about 30% of the applied moisture that we gave there. So it's just taking a lot longer for those materials to dry out. And then when we look at weed control studies, we see that the hardwood, especially on seeds that are added above the mulch layer, that's where we see a negative effect of these materials that are finely shredded, whether it's hardwood or pine bark or anything. It all depends upon how it's processed. So this is the impact of mulch on light. So pine straw, hardwood, and pine bark with these different bars. This is the amount of light that they're actually blocking out. Really, once we get up to about an inch, we're blocking out almost 100% of the light there. And then this is different mulch types, and then this is the fresh weight of 3 different types of weeds. So crabgrass, eclipta, and garden spurge. And in these studies, when we average it out across the different depths, we don't see a whole lot of difference in the mulch type. If we're applying that mulch at an adequate depth, so at least 2 inches, we don't have that much difference in mulch type, especially on those seeds that are below the soil. But then when we look at depth, this is really what's critical. So at 1 inch, we had very high eclipta germination and growth right here. But with the other species, really where we're seeing the biggest benefit is at 2 to 4 inches. When we get to 2 to 4 inches, 2 to 3 inches, whatever, somewhere around that range, that's when we really start to see a big advantage of the mulch compared to having no mulch, or even comparing it to herbicides. So what did this teach us? Depths higher than 1 inch, they don't block out more light, but they do create a greater physical barrier. So you are likely to get better control of weed seeds that are already present in the soil, as opposed to weeds that are landing on top. And then mulches, they do need to drain quickly to work effectively. And you can kind of tell this when you go and you look at bags. If you buy mulches in bags, if you go and you pick up a bag of mulch, and you can just tell that it's holding a lot of moisture. It might be great for plants, and it still might be a good mulch material, but it might just not be the best for weed control. But it's still going to be a lot better than nothing. So pick mulches that are attractive and affordable. You want them to drain well. You want them to be durable. Bark tends to be the longest lasting. It goes bark, wood, and then straw. But all those all are good options, and they all have different benefits. Use or not of herbicides. Herbicides can provide a cost savings even if you're using them in conjunction with the mulches. If you want to do that like a pre-emergence herbicide, they can work together very effectively. And herbicides are going to cost a fraction of mulch costs. Mulches are going to be more expensive, but they're going to always, one mulch application is always going to outperform one herbicide application. So mulches, you do get your money's worth out of those. Here's just some example installation costs for the different ones. Pine bark is typically more expensive than pine straw. I mean, you look at the costs for like a 25 square foot block with mulch versus a herbicide. So a herbicide is going to be a fraction of that cost. But if you got over the course of a year, here's the bark with no herbicide. Here's just herbicide. And you can see the difference. This is the cost. So this is the maintenance cost. And this would be like at a professional company that was going out and actually hand weeding the bed. So bark is reducing the cost by quite a bit. The herbicide really didn't reduce that much when we had no mulch at all, or no mulch or herbicide. This is the control block here. Bark, adding herbicide to the bark reduced it a little bit compared to the bark alone. But really the mulches were doing a pretty good job on their own, and they outcompeted the herbicide over the course of a year. So other methods in mulch beds, we can use pre-emergence and post-emergence herbicides. If you look at some of those EDIS publications that I've done, I have all of your different options there. The pre-emergence herbicides will be the same ones that you can use in turf grass. And then post-emergence herbicides, you have things like graminicides, so things like fusilade, envoy, segment. They're only going to be effective on grasses, but they would be good options for things like Bermuda grass or torpedo grass that's growing up through the canopy of some of your landscape plants. So those graminicides could be effective in those cases. And then also in those non-turf areas, we have the non-selective herbicides, so things like glyphosate, diquat, and then a lot of organic products as well. And there's, of course, there's a lot of controversy out there about glyphosate. I have an article on it as well on the EDIS website. I'm not going to get into that, but if someone were wanting to use quote-unquote natural or organic herbicides only, you do have a lot of options there. These are just a few of those options. Again, I'd say if you were really interested in this and wanted to see some of these alternative herbicides, maybe they're not as common or widely used, to check out an article that I did. Just if you Google glyphosate alternatives Florida, yeah, you'll pull that up and you'll see all these different herbicides, and I get into the glyphosate issue a little bit in that publication as well. So color beds. So this is the second part. So this could be kind of classified in there with the mulch beds. But again, I say the color beds would be something that there's no permanent plants in there, or very few permanent plants. It's going to be something that's tilled or replanted seasonally, or at least every year. Something that there's a lot of annual plants that are planted in there fairly regularly. So what are some options for color beds? There are some herbicides, some graminicides like I talked about, and then some softer pre-emergence herbicides, something like trifluralin or preen, basically the same thing. Mulch, fine texture mulch might make some sense here, just because you don't have to have the weed control for a long period of time. If those beds are planted where those species are close together, they're going to do a pretty good job of outcompeting those weeds. And if you have to go in and retill that area before you go in and replant, you don't want big chunks of pine bark or wood chips or something like that in there, which can make it more difficult to go in there and plant. Another thing, so I always talk about landscape fabric, and I'm personally not a big fan of landscape fabric, just because in my experience with it, it works very good for a short period of time, and then it makes hand weeding and weed control more difficult towards the end. But in these color beds, landscape fabric would make a lot of sense, because you could put that landscape fabric down. You only have to get weed control for a few months for the life of those landscape plants. Then when those plants die, you go in, you pull the fabric up, and then you could put it back down and replant into that. With the landscape fabrics, it's very important that they're in place and they're cut properly and things like that while the plants are going in. So in these areas where you're replanting fairly regularly, the landscape fabric would make a lot of sense there. And then also crowding out weeds by slightly overplanting areas. And then you could also just do nothing, hand pull, focus on sanitation, keeping weeds free, in those other areas, and that can be effective too. and these smaller areas that are more high maintenance. You just know automatically that you're going to be spending more time hand weeding those cases. But here's just some examples. So something like this. This is sold. This is a landscape fabric that's pre-cut for vegetables and things. But something like this will work fine for a a color bed. I've heard of people using newspapers. And woody, landscape beds. I don't think that will make much sense. Those newspapers are not going to be around very long. But maybe in a color bed, it might make some sense because you get a few extra weeks of weed control there. Overplaying the beds where you just have plants spaced really close together, that could work. And then also using mulch just like you would in other beds. Maybe a finer textured mulch around those annuals would work in a lot of cases as well. And then hardscapes. So pavers and things like that, a big place for weeds to come up, can be very frustrating to control those weeds. So oftentimes people turn to these ground clear type products, and that's kind of what these products were intended to be used for. So these glyphosate combinations, they may have something like a Mazepure, and Mazepure, or Indaziflam as one of the active ingredients in there. And those are soil sterilant. Well, the Mazepure and Mazepure, Indaziflam isn't, but Mazepure and Mazepure are kind of soil sterilant type herbicides, so they're very long lasting. And so those could be used in those cracks and things like that in driveways and work. But very careful with these products that you don't use those around plants, because this is what can happen. These are symptoms of ALS herbicide damage on landscape plants. So if you use some of these plants, even just spraying a little bit of those around the base of a plant, you went and you sprayed a lawn, then you see a couple weeds around the ligustrum or around the oak tree or something like that, and you're just going to zap them real quick. This is what can happen with a very small rate of one of those active ingredients. Those are very powerful herbicides, and if you use those anywhere within the root zone of these plants, this is the kind of damage that you can get. So this is ligustrum. You get this tufted growth here. That can be caused from mites also, but herbicides can cause these symptoms quite often on a lot of different landscape plants. So be very careful if you're going to use those types of herbicides. Flame weeding is a good choice for these hardscape areas and things like that. So using these torches and things to burn those weeds off. You don't have anything in close proximity that is going to get hurt. Flame weeding and turf grass, that are in landscape beds, that can be effective, but you have a good chance of possibly burning some of those nearby plants. But flame weeding, it's scientifically proven to be the most rewarding and satisfying method of weed management. That's proven scientifically. No, I'm being facetious, but it is good for driveways, walkways, and then also solicitors, or people that you don't want at your house. It's very intimidating to walk up onto a property and someone is standing out there with a flamethrower, basically. But you're not using herbicides. You're not burning anything. You don't have to hold it on there to actually burn the plant material. You're just bursting those plant cells and causing those weeds to die. It's similar to those contact herbicides. This can be most effective on annual weeds, but those are also going to be the most common weeds that you're going to see in those pavers and driveways and things, are the things that are spreading from seed. And then lastly, vegetable gardens. So you're typically going to want to avoid herbicides in these areas because with these herbicides, so some herbicides can be used around foods, of course, but there's going to be harvest restrictions where people can't go in and harvest those fruits or vegetables until they know that herbicide is dissipated. But it's very difficult to follow those guidelines. Plus, buying those pesticides that we can use in food can be very difficult, in homeowner type quantities. So generally best to avoid those and kind of go with a quasi-organic kind of method, or just avoid using of pesticides in those food areas. Is the garden highly visible? Some things to think about. Is it highly visible? Is it something where you want a lot of function, where you're just worried about food producing, you want to grow as much food as possible, or are aesthetics important? Is it something that's going to be visible, that you want to look good and then also have food? So these are some different things to consider. Also, the size of the area is something to consider too. So before planting, regardless of how big it is, Solarization is a great way to control weeds and kind of give you a very good head start. Basically just clearing up the area with plastic, maybe tilling it up, watering that soil down to get it nice and moist, a few inches deep, and then covering it with clear plastic, letting that get up to, 130, 140 degrees, and leaving that plastic on for a few weeks. It does a really good job of controlling a lot of weeds. It'll kill pests, especially weed seeds 12 to 18 inches deep. Wet conditions are needed. You want to do it in the warm time of the year. In Florida, the spring is an ideal time prior to planting, if we're going to plant something in the summer. But basically, we want those warm temperatures. Really, in some parts of the state, we can do this just about any time of the year. Basically, especially if we have direct sunlight, we just want that soil temperature to get to be, 130, 140 degrees. It's going to be most effective on annuals, and some perennials will survive it, but it'll also do a good job of controlling diseases and the nematodes as well. But the nematodes can move, but it can reduce some populations, right there in the immediate area where you are planting those vegetables. This is some work that Sean Steed did. So this is, he found by solarizing nursery media, he got an 80 to 90% reduction in weed germination. So you can see the differences there, solarized at 14 days, getting it up to 140 degrees, almost 100% weed control versus, very high weed coverage right here when the soil was not solarized. So other options for larger areas, if you didn't care that much about the aesthetics, plastic culture could work. If you have a way to do drip irrigation, you can buy drip tubing for very cheap. And then use that plastic several years in a row. It's not going to get used up like, it would in a commercial operation. So you could do that, with drip irrigation underneath it. Landscape fabric, you might not even need to cover it. You could just plant directly in that landscape fabric, and that could be used to control weeds in some of those small areas like you have here, where basically they just tacked it into the ground and then cut holes for their plants and then planted it into that landscape fabric. Mulch is also, going to be effective. It'd be a little bit more difficult to use the mulch, or it might be more expensive. Just depends upon the situation. But smaller areas, mulch works. The landscape fabric would work, and then also hand weeding. You might just opt to hand weed or hoe if it is a smaller area and it is manageable. So in summary, a lot of different options are going to work for these different areas, and often the best control is going to be achieved with a combination of different options. Typically, one of these options is going to be, the cure-all. You're going to have to use multiple different things depending upon the weed species. And usually what is best for the plants is going to be best for weed control, because whatever we can do to keep the plants healthy and is going to work with us, for us to control the weeds. And I always say that the best offense is a good defense. So getting a good defense by keeping plants healthy enough to defend themselves against the weeds. This is especially true in those areas like turf grass, where oftentimes the number one problem is that turf is not healthy, and it allows weeds to come in and be secondary invaders. So with that, I will I'll hand it back over to John, and then take any questions that anyone has.
Hey, everybody, if you got questions, like if you go over to your controls and you want to unmute it or allow your video to be present, like this is the time. And then we'll do this for about, 10, little over 10 minutes, and then we'll go to all members meeting. So, but if you got questions, now's the time. And we've got them here on the chat too. So I'll try and bring some of those up.
What was the publication number of the homeowner herbicide guide?
It was, let's see.
I tried to see it, but it was too small and I couldn't make it out.
ENH 1311.
Yeah, ENH 1311.
Okay, I'm going to print that out. Thank you.
John, this is Dina. I have a question that I actually included in the chat. Chris, you didn't mention leaves as a mulch.
Leaves?
Leaves. Good old leaves.
Yeah.
Yes. Why?
So yeah, so leaves would be so yeah, I mean that could work as a mulch. If someone were to go through, said they picked them up in their lawnmower and they had a bunch of chipped up leaves or just the leaves that are falling, they can be a good natural mulch. If you compared that to something like pine bark, it's not going to be near as effective for a long period of time because those leaves are going to degrade very quickly. And then also, if someone picks those up with a mower, you're also probably picking up a lot of weed seeds too, in a lot of cases. So the leaves aren't going to be the most effective method of mulch, but there's a lot of advantages to those. They add a lot of organic matter to those beds or wherever they're used as mulch. And if someone had a lot of tree cover and a lot of leaves, and they could do that fairly regularly, even though those weeds broke down relatively quickly, they would still serve as a pretty good mulch because you're continually reapplying those and they're free too. So, it could be a good a mulch. So if you compare one application of leaves to one application of pine bark or something like that, the pine bark is going to beat it, but leaves have a lot of other benefits, that pine bark and then some of these other mulches don't have. So.
I enjoyed your program. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay, so here we got some questions in here. So there's one about floor mulch superior to other types. That looks more like a comment. But yeah, floor mulch, we've done some work with it, and it's good. And the reason I like floor mulch is because I believe that is the one with it, which is ground up melaleuca trees. You're killing an invasive tree while you're mulching your lawn, or mulching, your landscape, which is good. And then the best treatment to get rid of dollarweed and St. Augustine grass. Herbicide. If it was, if you're looking for herbicides there, there's not too many that are terribly effective on that. There's a few broadleaf type herbicides that will control dollarweed, but it's generally going to be something that you'd have to do multiple applications with. The active ingredients that you would want to look for, probably something like metsulfuron. It's fairly good on dollarweed after a couple applications. I've talked to other master gardeners and also some people that have done some work with some of these retail herbicides, and they found that the Roundup for lawns, that it will have some activity on dollarweed also, and that's because it does contain pinoxalam, which is a herbicide that has pretty good activity on dollarweed and is often used in rice to control things like dollarweed. So that could be an option as well. Yeah, dollarweed's a tough one, and no matter what herbicide you use, you're typically going to be more than one application to get control of it. Let's see. And there's
quite a few questions here.
Okay.
On the chat. So is there an EDIS publication specifically on mulch and weed control? I see some on mulch in general, but no regards to weed control.
So I've got one on, so it's not on mulch specifically, but I have a lot of information in there on mulch, and it's improving weed control in landscape planting beds. And that's one that we did several years ago. And that's kind of an all-inclusive type presentation, or type publication, and has information on herbicides and mulch and all kinds of different things, even some design considerations and things. So that might be one where it has some information. But yeah, we probably need to do one on just mulches, because we've done a lot of work with mulches over the last 4 or 5 years. So.
Okay, you got some more questions here. So you mentioned no effective control of Bermuda grass and turf grass. Are there any products that are effective for grassy weeds and turf grass? And are there any products that are effective on grassy weeds and peanut used in ground cover? I guess perennial peanut.
Yeah. So Bermuda grass and St. Augustine grass. So that would be the only case where you wouldn't have effect, or Bahia grass too. Um, it depends upon the turf grass. We don't want to consider all turf grasses the same. Bermuda grass and zoysia, still difficult to control, but we have fusilade. So fusilade can be used, and it's labeled for use in zoysia grass, and will control Bermuda over time. So that will be one there. For other grasses, St. Augustine and Bahia are going to be the two that are going to be most difficult to control grassy weeds in. We do have some options for Bermuda and things like centipede and zoysia. Zoysia especially, because we have things like fusilade that can be used. It's a graminicide that can be used to control some grasses in zoysia, but for St. Augustine grass and Bahia grass, we don't really have anything to control grassy weeds other than the pre-emergence herbicides. And then for perennial peanut, the question there, same thing. Actually, grassy weeds, if you have grasses in your perennial peanut, very easy to control, or at least we have some very good options. So things like Envoy, which is clethodim, Segment, which is cefoxidum, Fusilade, which is fluazepop. All those are graminicides. You will probably be able to get, you can order small quantities of any of those, a quart for $15, $20, on some of those do-it-yourself websites. You can get any of those products in very small quantities, or you can go to, Home Depot, Lowe's, something like that, and they have these things that are called, they might call them grass killers or something, but they have those active ingredients in there. All those, none of them are labeled for use on perennial peanut, where it doesn't have perennial peanut listed as a safe species, but they're all labeled for use in landscape. So therefore, those herbicides could be used to control grassy weeds in perennial peanut in the landscape. And we've done a lot of testing with those, and we haven't ever seen any injury. Same thing with sedges. We can control sedges in perennial peanut, but we cannot control broadleaf. That's what's difficult. It's a lot more difficult to control a broadleaf in a broadleaf, or a grass in a grass, as opposed to vice versa.
Oh, cool. Yeah, definitely this Florida Homeowner Herbicide Guide and some of these others have been like little Bibles here for us in the plant clinic in terms of people that are trying to control stuff.
Sure.
I guess I got one more question. Is there a new commercial St. Augustine variety that is made to accept Roundup to kill other turf grass? I think that maybe there's something that one of the other speakers brought up about that.
Yeah, and I think it's Provista. I think that's the name of it. But yeah, so Scott's came out with a Roundup Ready turfgrass. Basically, it's a Roundup Ready St. Augustine, and then so someone can plant that, and then they can go in and control, grasses, broadleaves, whatever, with glyphosate. So there is, I believe it's Provista is the name of it, but I could be mistaken on that. But I'm sure if someone Googled, glyphosate resistant or glyphosate tolerant St. Augustine, you'd be able to find that. But yeah, it is available. It's been planted. You can find lawns. I deal with I deal with the pest control industry a lot, and they have several lawns up in the villages and different places in Central Florida that have the lawns planted with that particular type of turf grass.
Well, very cool. I feel like that that's a lot of information to drop on us here, but I mean, we can't get enough of it as well, because so much of what we do is managing turf in Central Florida. So thank you for being here, Dr. Marble. Really appreciate it. And
absolutely.
And I look forward to, having you back at some point down the road and talking more about weeds and
sure.
A lot of your research you got going on, in their management. So,
Sure. Absolutely. I'd be happy to.
all right. Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
I
Y'all
guess
have a good, thank you all for having me.
we'll go over to the all members meeting here. For everybody that is still here. I'm looking at what I got in the chat. If you guys got any points, I guess the biggest thing that I want to bring up here is that beginning June 15th, we're reopening for the clinic, and we will also be reopening the garden to volunteer opportunities for folks that do not fall within the vulnerable population range status based on CDC guidelines. So I just wanted to go ahead and let you know that, like Tia, I'll be providing more information with that in a follow-up email here. And if you've got questions about volunteer outside, I think basically what she's got planned is only 2 people, 2 volunteers permitted via VMS for being out in the garden. And it will be from 8 to 10 a.m., Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Just wanted to let you know that this is part of our repopulating, as they're calling it here. And but if you've got any, I think that's the biggest relevant thing. Outside of that, not too much has changed here. I think maybe I'll send you in an email as well. The Legacy Award Committee, I believe, is going to be meeting the 17th of next month. And we'll provide Zoom information for that too, for anybody, all interested parties. But outside that, if anybody's got any comments or questions, go ahead and mute yourself, throw it out there, and you've got the floor.
John, this is Patricia, and I just wanted to know, you're going to select the people for the plant clinic, but we need to sign up in VMS for the gardens. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, we're I think that you should try and contact Tia before signing up and everything. I think that,
Oh, okay.
so kind of the same protocol, like just, making sure everything, I maybe it will get to the point here that it'll be kind of automated on VMS, like, every other week or whatever for whoever wants to volunteer for that given time and that given place, like Mondays, like every other Monday, that type of thing. But that's more of Tia's like department in terms of how she's going to manage it. I'm trying to, depending on what people want, either every week or every other week. And then like I mentioned, 4 hours, 8 to 12, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2 2-hour shifts on Thursday and Tuesday. So,
Thank you.
so anything else?
John, you mentioned last week that you were going to open up the plant clinic on, I believe it's June 1st, by yourself for 4 hours in the morning. Is that still on plan?
Yes. Starting Monday, I'll be opening up here. Maybe I'll take some pictures, include them in the message. Like, we've got big giant sneeze guards like in place that they just brought in. We've kind of set it up to like prevent people from able to just walk right into the clinic, kind of try and maximize our distance between us and the public. And I mean, they got to go through the front desk anyway, and it's all by appointment. But outside of that, I'm going to see how it works starting Monday next week. So
Maybe we'll all with a question.
What's that?
Maybe we'll all call with a plant question.
I've been getting plenty of questions from master gardeners. Anything, was there a specific question related to that, or?
No, just being funny.
Okay. All right, folks. Well, unless something else pops up here, I think there, yes, Amber sent something here. Might be. Oh, so this is coming from social media, Amber Boas. I was thinking that it might be interesting for master gardeners to create videos on specific topics or plant uh, or plants from home, and then they could be sent in and approved, and then perhaps we can throw them up on our social media. Not live videos, but pre-recorded videos. That would be another option for volunteers to contribute without actually being here. So, yeah, if you're interested in anything that you know could contribute, doing videos, getting some experience with technology and presenting, I would super encourage anybody to do that, and just let me know, let Amber know, let potentially even hit up Dina too, because since she's the speakers bureau chair. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to keep plugging that, like, on the emails too. How do we divide this time for VMS? We should let's go for 45. I think this is kind of typical. Like, go for 45 for the educational component and 15 for the post meeting here. I think we're about to wrap up. So I think if you rounded it, it's barely over for right now. Okay. Yeah, and send pictures of your yards. How many volunteers are eligible to work? I think so far, in terms of just for the plant clinic, I've had 5 or 6 people respond back. So that's where we're at currently. And I was planning on just kind of talking in more details about operations with that, like for when people actually start showing up in a couple of weeks in person. So, and then going over that in more detail then. No need to get into too many details here when it's not really relevant for the majority of the program here. So anything else? VMS doesn't allow you to volunteer yet after 6:15. Do we need to reach out to you directly to volunteer? I think that, like, after 6, yeah, we're kind of blocking it off right now. And if you need to volunteer, like, if you want to volunteer, reach out to me and Shalise, please. Like, and we'll figure it out from there. But like I mentioned, I think that June, July, probably August, like, it's going to be the situation is going to be very different than what we normally do, where we do it 6 months at a time. So I'll follow up with an email here. I'll give you guys the past couple classes and this one. I've recorded them. And so those will be there too via YouTube. And outside of that, stay safe. Glad to see so many of you folks here and staying involved with the program. And I hope the content's been pretty decent so far. And adopt a tree. I got a question here. No word on adopt a tree. Nothing is happening in that department as far as we can tell. Basically, I wouldn't expect anything remotely towards, like, us bringing that back until maybe September. So, all right, signing out. You guys take care.
Sayonara.
See you next week.
Okay.